just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to the conversation for today. Brenda, in a moment, is going to give a brief presentation. She's a CALÓ News journalist born in Querétaro, Mexico, and raised in South Central LA. And in a moment, she's going to be doing a brief presentation on her reporting that she's done on hate and anti-hate since 2022 under California State Library's Stop the Hate program. And she's actually recently been given a grant from the LA Press Club to continue her reporting on systemic racism. So congratulations, Brenda. We appreciate all your work. And in addition to the reporting done by CALÓ News, the Latino Media Collaborative, which along with CALÓ News convened today's conversation, we've been working tirelessly with additional partners to produce articles that raise awareness of hate crimes within the Latino community, highlighting the need for these resources, and also promoting educational tools and to combat hate crimes. And so just to give a shout out to some of our partner outlets that have been doing this news reporting, they're not all in the room, there might be one or two, but just to list them here: Alianza Metropolitan News in the Bay Area, El Informador del Valle, El Latino, El Popular, El Tímpano, Hispanic LA, Impulso, KBCR, La Nueva Voz, La Opinión, Latino Times, San Fernando Valley Sun, Vida en el Valle, Vita News. All these partner outlets have also been part of this collaborative effort to do more news reporting on these important issues that you're going to hear more about in this panel conversation. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Brenda to give her a presentation.
I'll start off with a diversity welcome and that I learned in organizing spaces in South Central. So it goes, I'd like to welcome people of all genders. This may include people who identify as women, men, cis, trans, non-binary, genderqueer, or others. I'd like to welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, European descent, and those who identify as Hispanic, Latina, Latinx, people of indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. I'd like to welcome languages spoken here, whether that is Spanish, English, Spanglish, native language, sign language. I'd like to also welcome those in attendance who are coming from South Central, East LA, the Valley, Silver Lake, Long Beach, Bakersfield, Chinatown, Orange County, or wherever else you're coming from. I'd like to welcome people with disabilities, whether that's visible or invisible. I'd like to welcome gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others who none of these labels fit. I'd like to welcome survivors as well. I'd like to welcome people who identify as activists or organizers, reporters, community advocates, city officials, students, and most importantly, the community members of our LA County. I also like to welcome your emotions, whether you're feeling happy, nervous, blissful, whether you have some disappointment or rage or you're nervous. I'd like to welcome those as well. I'd like to welcome those who supported you to be here today. I'd like to welcome your families, genetic or otherwise. I'd like to welcome people who have attended all 3 Diálogo events, and I'd like to welcome those whose first time is today. And I also like to welcome people of different faiths, different religions, whether different faith practices, whether it's agnostic, atheist, seekers, power practices, or practices that don't belong to a tradition. I'd like to welcome those that are dear to us that have passed away or have died. And I also like to welcome our elders who might be here in the room or who are not and are just in our lives. And finally, I'd like to welcome the ancestors who lived and continue to live in this land where we stand today, and that is the Tonga Nation. And yeah, welcome everyone. I hope that you all feel a little bit and get a little bit of information from our dialogue today. I'll go ahead and get started with the anti-hate news coverage that we've done throughout the years. So in June 2022, we began the anti-hate series, and it began from our own newsroom commitment to really bring more attention to hate crimes and the hate that was happening in LA County. We felt like there was not a lot of outlets really emphasizing the importance of the very bad or alarming statistics that we have. We also wanted to support hate crime prevention and practices, and more importantly, create a space that to highlight and amplify the work that is happening of like anti-hate experts and people that are helping the community with hate crimes. And since then, we've done a lot of work. We published at least 2 articles of hate or anti-hate a month. With that being said, we have a total of 38 anti-hate stories, and then we also have a lot of produced video as well. And yeah, these are some of them. We feature like some experts, LA County experts, or we also feature just personal stories. We have the California versus Hate Initiative, and then we have folks like Dolores Huerta really talking about hate and what that means today. And some key findings that I wanted to share with y'all as a journalist. So, having reported this for 2 years, I think it's definitely been challenging. One of the things that I was talking to a colleague not so long ago was that there's an underlying negative stigma that Latinos or other people of color have when referring themselves as victims. I think we've seen how hard it is for folks to share their stories just because I feel like in a lot of our communities, it's really not looked at right to be a victim or to need help or to have or to receive any sort of assistance. So, and that's why one of my biggest challenging things in the recent years has been actually getting someone to sit with me and just tell me about their story. I haven't really gotten any of that because again, it's just very stigmatized. The second thing that just really noticing is that there is trauma and PTSD from a lot of like emotions and things that happen when a hate crime happens. And I've seen this play out. Sometimes I've had folks share an anecdote or a specific incident when they saw a hate crime and they told me like, oh, this was 12 years ago. This was 20 years ago. And the fact that it's so vivid in their minds, or that they don't want to take police transportation because that's where the hate incident occurred. It just goes to say that the hate incident is not just a one snapshot thing, it lives on people's mind for a long, long time. The third thing that I've seen in the reporting is that there's a lot of underreporting when it comes to hate crimes. And I think a lot of the annual reports of hate really convey this as well. You know, underreporting happens because one thing is like language barriers. A lot of folks feel like, well, I'm going to call a number, but I don't know if they're going to be able to speak to me in English or Spanish, or they're going to be able to speak to my grandma or grandparents in their language. So there is that language barrier. There's also the drugs and police. So most of the time when they ask you to go and report a hate crime, 911 is the number that people tend to call. And I think when talking to some anti-hate experts, a lot of what they're saying is that people do not trust the police as much as they did, and therefore are not calling these incidents in. So this is what the community aspect, or these community organizations really convey the necessity and bring in those resources of like, even if you're not talking to a police person, like how can we still make sure that we could gain and know about what happened, know about that incident. The fourth thing that I found that I thought was important to highlight is just the culturally component resources and support that are still very much needed. I think we need to really think about how one solution does not fit everyone, and really thinking outside of the box and say everyone has a particular way of being, and hate incidents are really targeted throughout. And I think when we talk about culturally competent resources, really asking victims or really asking survivors, how do you need help? Like, how can we help you, and what does assistance look like to you? So yeah, those are some key findings. And I wanted to also share some statistics. Feel free to take some pictures of this if you like, but this is from the 2022 Hate Crime Report by the LA County Commission on Human Relations. This is all statistics based on LA County. There are statistics that are also in other counties outside of LA, and there's a bigger one of California, but this year I just wanted to focus on LA County. We have, sorry, I'm a bit blind, but We have anti-Latino crimes rose 3% and experienced the highest rate of violence. So some hate crimes are not violent per se, but anti-Latinos have the biggest rate of them actually being violent. Then we have African Americans were overrepresented and have actually been overrepresented for quite some time. They make up 53% of racial hate crimes or hate crime victims. And then we have 18% of hate crimes were motivated by sexual orientation, and 81 of these crimes targeted gay men. Another really cool, well not cool, but I think very important statistic is that race was by far the most common motivation. And another thing is that hate crimes in which anti-immigration slurs were said, that accounted for 12% of the 94. Oh wait. Hate crimes in which anti-immigrant slurs were used continued to climb 12%, and the 94 crimes comprised the largest number ever recorded. So this report has been going on since the 1980, and since then, actually, anti-immigration or anti-immigrant slurs have been the highest in 2022. The last one that I want to share is that there were 44 anti-transgender crimes, the largest number ever documented as well, and 91% of these crimes were violent. This is a rate much higher than racial, sexual orientation, and other religious attacks. And one thing to note about the report is that it comes out every fall, so this is the 2022 hate crime report that came out earlier in 2023, and then the things for 2023, or the hate crimes that are being accounted for in 2023 are going to come out this fall in 2024. And last of all, just some hotlines and reporting tools. We have LA versus Hate, which is the LA County's just emergency hotline, which is 211, and they offer not just if folks want to report it and make a police statement, they can, but they also offer just mental health resources, or if folks need housing, if that was very traumatic and they need some support with that, they also offer that. We have California versus Hate, which is just, they were inspired actually by LA versus Hate, and they just launched, they have a year, so they're a fairly new initiative, and they do the same thing. They have folks that, in both places, they have folks that speak a lot of languages, so not just Spanish and English, but having that support and that bridging the gap between language is, I think, very important, and they do that. So these are some phone numbers. We have a lot of reporting online as well, so if you go to CALÓnews.org, you can see a lot of these stories that we've been talking about, and just highlighting our funders and really highlighting folks that make this work actually possible. But yeah, that's it for me. Hopefully there's some numbers and statistics that you all can really go home and maybe share.
I'm Zacarias. I am a CALÓ News reporter and a Berkeley Local News Fellow. So we have an amazing panel for you guys today. Firstly, I just want to take a second to acknowledge Brenda and that presentation. I've been really fortunate to work alongside Brenda. And Brenda is an incredibly talented young journalist who has really hit the ground running. And I think a lot of times people have questions about the intersections of the work we do as CALÓ News, the newsroom, and the LMC. And I think she did a really great job of showcasing the ways that we both kind of uplift and empower Latino communities through our coverage and our reporting. So thank you, Brenda. So moving on to the panel, we're really excited to have this conversation with you today. It's Diálogo, right, on overcoming hate and building solidarity. Before we do that, I want to allow the panelists an opportunity to share a little bit about themselves. We have a new panelist here who is not on the pamphlet, but if y'all could just share your name, your pronouns, your role, and a little bit about the work that you do as it pertains to the panel.
Sure. Okay. Adrian Pantoja, I'm a professor of political science and chicano studies at Pitzer College. I'm also a pollster with Moreno, Segura, and Partners. So I've been doing polling for close to 30 years now, so I've been just tracking Latino public opinion and attitudes for a long, long time. One of the reasons I got into this was just as a way of shattering stereotypes and myths about Latinos, to show with scientifically collected data, essentially to, various individuals, like, you're wrong, this is what in fact Latinos believe, and this is their behavior. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Good afternoon, Benny Torres. I'm the president and CEO of CDTech. We're a South Central LA-based community and economic development organization. I also wear a different hat. I'm also on the board of directors for LMC. And doing work in South Central Los Angeles for the last 30 years has really brought the issue of understanding these critical themes on the ground in terms of how people deal with this on the ground, day-to-day basis. And I've been able to see the evolution of the thinking in terms of tension, to show the difference between hate and actually the economic conditions that create sometimes the tension and the violence that we see in our communities, primarily in South Central Los Angeles. So I think that's the lens I'll be bringing here today. Thank you.
Hi everybody, so I'm Imelda Padilla, and I am a council member for the city of Los Angeles for the 6th district. And I've been a community organizer in that region for a very long time. And I believe that I was invited to be part of this panel, as I am somebody who won in a special election following one of the most arguably ruckus events in Latino politics that took place a few years ago. Some not very fine moments from some of our political leaders, and here I am today.
I'm Andy Ruiz. I was actually the first staff attorney hired at St. John's Community Health. I was actually hired under the Stop the Hate unit, so I focused on hate crimes and hate incidents. My predominant focus was undocumented Latinos and transgender folks. After that, I transitioned down to a different role, so I do development and community empowerment. So I do a lot of the Know Your Rights presentations and all the fun stuff people strive their whole careers to get to, rather than just being cooped up in an office. I think I was invited because I do a lot of work organizing and activism work around legal issues as well as restorative justice.
All right, thank you so much for that. I'm really excited to hear what kind of lively dialogue or maybe debate there might be. So before we get started, when we talk about overcoming hate and building solidarity, we have to talk about disinformation, right? And disinformation as it pertains to Latino communities, we know shows up in a lot of different ways. It can show up in Latino voting patterns, it can show up in stereotypes about immigration, it shows up in media through counter-narratives. So we know, as Brenda kindly pointed out, the research has shown significant numbers of racist and discriminatory incidents against Latinos. However, historically, Latinos have had very low reported crimes, right? Reports on incidents such as hate crimes. So my question to the panelists is, in your line of work or research, what do you see as being the primary barriers for the Latino community in reporting on these incidents?
I'll jump in. Multiple things, I think, aspects of why Latinos don't report. There is still a fear with LAPD. I can tell you my first year at St. John's, I spent a lot of time just going with folks to go make a police report because officers would deny them that right. There is certain protocols that they have to follow for hate crimes that they're not following at all. Another thing too that I get is when they do get a Spanish speaker, and we talk about people's language skills, but some of these individuals do not know how to translate properly. So what they're getting is a very butchered story that doesn't show up in the police report. So if you do report that you're being harassed because of your race or an identity, it doesn't show up in the police report. And so then that itself takes away some of their protections. Another thing too is I've been seeing is a lot of Latino officers, which is the sad part, is Latino officers will tell them, oh, I've been through worse. This is a civil matter. Don't worry about it. So we get a lot of backlash there. Another issue too, and this goes to cultural issues in our community, and I'm in a weird intersection being trans and Latino, that I'm in a spot where I understand it, but tapamos por la familia, like we cover for others in the neighborhood and families. So when there is some sort of homophobic or transphobic thing happening in the neighborhood, you cover for it. You don't report it because you don't want to be a snitch per se and get stitches, right? But that is still a common practice and why people don't report. For trans folks, I mean, and LGBT folks in general, like this is something that we don't do in the Latino community. We're just taught to like take it and get over it and move on, or move away, right? We have that white dream of moving to San Francisco or Silver Lake and finding our happy endings there, but not all Latino queer people have that opportunity or even the funds to be able to do that.
I think as you're saying in terms of the participation, I think a historic relationship with police is critical. But when we talk about hate crimes, we're assuming that it only takes place like out in the street or like it's something that happens in the community. The motivation behind discriminating against somebody, Latinos in this case, related to hate can happen at the workplace, can happen in a lot of different places. And so how we frame it, I think, is a critical part of it. I mean, I have trouble sometimes, especially over the last couple of years, as we saw during COVID. I would get a lot of calls as being one of the only Chicanos who runs a nonprofit in South Central Los Angeles. You're going to be in this fine line between where's your identity, where do you stand on these positions, and sometimes these issues around hate crimes become wedge issues in our community in terms of how they're framed. For example, I would get a lot of calls and say, hey, Benny, black folks are attacking street vendors because they're Latino immigrants and they're stealing from them. And my thing was like, where is this happening? What communities? Is the motivation that, or is it simply economics? Because my response would be like, how come there's no uproar when all the street vendors on 6th Street in MacArthur Park are getting taxed by Latino gang members and nobody says anything about it? But you want to make this about a hate crime. Is it really about that? Or is it more about economics? And how do we begin to address those core root systemic issues that create this environment that many times, unfortunately, media polarize it? And so there's so much confusion that people don't want to report because they don't really know if it's motivated by hate or just part of where you grow up in the economics that we live in. So in South Central, we live in somewhat of a bubble in the sense that we are very uniquely positioned as black and brown folks of all different identities within those two large racial communities, right, or ethnic communities, in terms of how we see this issue. So for me, we need continued engagement systemically between institutions and communities. We need more education and understanding of what hate crimes really mean. How do they play out in community spaces and workspaces and other types of places in our communities and in our culture too, to get a better sense of what that looks like. I think there's just not enough clarity, and so people confuse it. Sometimes people pin people against each other politically, racially, as we've seen, as what happened a couple of years back, even in the conversations. And we also have to understand that even as Latinos, we also do that within ourselves. We have a very anti-indigenous, anti-darker skinned people. There's a very strong anti-blackness component in our community. So we have to do a lot more to educate ourselves as well as institutions, and also force the media to really speak to these issues in a deeper way than just polarizing and sensationalizing the issues, in my opinion.
I would just briefly add, in terms of polling numbers, one of the saddest, well, there's so many like sad data points, but one of the ones that really struck me was looking at some Pew numbers where there were Latinos reporting incidents of anti-bias, racism, anti-Latino incidents. And about a quarter of those incidents, the respondents said came from other Latinos. So when Benny and Andy talked about this reluctance to report, there may be that reluctance, but there may be this failure to recognize, why am I being targeted? Why, the colorism or some of the other ugliness that happens. Maybe it's harder to recognize or to take action if it's coming from somebody that you say, well, this is somebody in my community. Is that really a hate crime? Is that really, what I'm experiencing? And so there might be, again, opportunities for education there in terms of what hate crimes are, what violence, what bias looks like, and does it have to come from somebody outside of the community, somebody from within?
And I think that's a really important point. We often talk about Latinos as being like a monolith, and we're not, right? And I think we have to kind of, when you're talking about the educational aspect of that, like, what are the different intersections of Latinidad, right? And we talked a little bit about indigenous erasure and anti-blackness and all of these other concepts that are showing up in the numbers of the stats. So I know, you had mentioned in previous that there is actually
as I mentioned, I've been polling for a long time, and one of the things that, well, first of all, let me backtrack. One of the things that got me into polling and studying the Latino population, and this is ancient history for some folks, and this is probably new history for some of you, was Prop 187 in California in the mid-1990s. And that was the beginning of this modern day anti-immigrant movement. And so, you know, it was those attacks against Latinos that led me to want to understand what's happening and how are Latinos responding to this. And in all the years of polling, one of the standard questions that we ask is, what are the top issues that are important to you in the community? What are the top issues the president or the Congress should address? And in 2020, for the first time, addressing racism was in the top 4. And that had never happened before. It's typically when you ask, you know, what are the Latino issues, you might think education, possibly crime, economics, bread and butter issues. But this time, we were really capturing, after these 4 years of the Trump presidency, this real sense of tension and fear. Other surveys were showing protecting immigrant rights. So clearly we had seen this shift where those of us who lived through this in California kind of said, oh, here we go again, but this is happening now on a national scale. It's no longer just Latinos in California experiencing this. This is Latinos widely experiencing this and saying the hate's got to stop.
I think speaking to this idea of combating disinformation, we talked a little bit about this, but how are some of the reoccurring myths that you see coming up in your line of work? I guess first of all, what are they? And how do you see us as a community pushing back on that? If you see us pushing back on that.
I think I could pivot off that and answer kind of both questions. So I just want to say that it's really flattering to be here with individuals that I consider social scientists, right? That are looking at this and observing it from an academic, qualitative perspective, and then putting it into productive conversations within the community from the perspective of a public servant, and seeing that these are the things that are coming out of academia and being reported. I think I see that within my constituents, this is a matter of, as mentioned, there's this fear of the police, so it's systemic. So the public service, the question is, for somebody that's new in this capacity at the level of the city, figuring out ways of addressing those systemic issues is supposed to be my role. It's supposed to be my job. And if I am somebody that is willing to be, and I am, what I would like to do is find ways of how we start to create the space to have conversations of how to address the fact that Latinos, folks that live in communities like the one that I represent, stop having distrust of the police to start. I also like to think that within the Latino community, there's a big sense of guilt for an embarrassment. So maybe they also just don't want to go and admit that they were like a victim of something, as mentioned by the presentation earlier. And also, another thing too is, depending on where they might feel they became the victim or of discrimination or the extreme of an actual hate crime, I think they also feel like they don't know where to go, right? Like if I was discriminated in housing, where do I make that complaint? If I was discriminated at work, what do I do? I don't think a lot of Latinos know what to do when they experience that. And as a public servant, I think it's our role to figure out how to build that bridge of knowing where to access the information so that they know that they're not alone. And there is ways to feed into organizations and the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely one clarification for sure, like is looking at where to report. Someone that's gone through this process, like when I got pulled onto this role, they said I was going to be focusing on admin law, right? That admin law is using our institutions to be able to support legal remedies. And I can tell you the 1 year that I focused purely on admin law, Civil Rights Department, Department of Social Services, the DPSS, what is the other one? Department of Consumer Affairs, EOC. On average, a lot of the responses, we're not getting any responses. We're not getting our own institutions that are built to support these folks to do anything. And so I think that's another issue that we do have and misconceptions is that people think just because you do report, something's gonna come out of it. There's a lot of people that come through our doors and there is no result. We file something and a year later they come back and they're like, something still hasn't happened. I'm like, no, nothing has happened yet. We have not gotten a result. And I think right now there needs to be a big push on institutional change on what enforcement looks like. Because yes, we have a reporting place, and I think that's the whole point of California versus hate, LA versus hate, Stop the Hate right now, is that we're trying to gauge all this data, put it together to show the world how much these services are needed and to up the funding for projects like this. Right now, one of the loopholes that we see, and I know a lot of the organizations don't like it, but when we do an admin complaint to the Civil Rights Department, we go to another social event, or LA versus hate or California versus hate, where they put us in a case management group, where they pass cases to us. It's the same case we reported. So it's a giant loophole. So then imagine a client getting our number again and being told, hey, nothing's gonna occur. So I think right now there needs to be a lot of institutional change. And then just another misinformation. The misinformation that I clarify for folks sometimes is that just because you report it doesn't mean something's gonna come out of it. We'll try to find a way, right? I throw everything at the wall like spaghetti, whatever sticks, sticks. I do it when I was practicing, I did it in a way that was legal, right? Like you wanna not do anything frivolous, but I did whatever I could. I'm very lucky that I am in a medical legal partnership at St. John's. I do have access to therapists and doctors and referrals where I send people through other services or housing support. Because I've also seen that holistically we address it in that way. Although our legal remedy might be taking a year or more, like at least they're getting immediate support to get out of that situation.
I was gonna say, I think we've talked a little bit about this, how sometimes it feels like you're just turning your wheel in these systems in place. What have you seen has been effective as a non-institutional alternative, if anything?
Yeah, I think we did talk about it a little bit. So for example, I really like mediation and restorative justice. Not every practitioner likes it, not everyone in the field likes it. Some people don't think it's something that can be done. I've seen it and it's just results. For example, using mediation as a tool to get a settlement outside of court. Like during the pandemic, there was a point where judges were not removing people from their homes. This individual, a single mom, had a young son who was per se gay. That's what the person kept accused, making them gay comments about a young man. And the individual was on a lease, and so they couldn't evict him. Stuck in that house with them, there was causing a lot of issues in the family. Judge was like, I can't evict during the pandemic. However, we used restorative justice mediation, and guess what? He agreed to a settlement to move out, and he moved out. And then we put that in the court writing, we put it in a settlement and agreement, we got him out. And it was kind of a shocker for me because, restorative justice, it's hard to be in that space sometimes, especially when you are asked to litigate and to do things. You want to focus on just court remedies, but we found that that was a way to provide those services. Another one too that I've seen with restorative justice is inter-family violence on hate. Per se, maybe your partner, your husband or your wife, I want to just be equal for the genders that are located in like a nuclear family. But if they're mistreating a child for being queer, right? It's talking to them, what are the repercussions of that? What if Child Protective Services finds out about this? What about the school? And having those discussions in a restorative way so that maybe it gives them more of an option to avoid separating the family, breaking it down. Obviously, there's limits to it. If there's abuse, then obviously we report it. But there's no physical violence yet. We try using that route as well.
One of the things that we've done in South LA, because we began to realize that these issues around education, understanding, in this case, understanding anti-Blackness and how it plays out in organizations, in our families, in our communities, with the entry point into being able to then have a conversation about what is anti-Latino, what is anti-Indigenous, right? But to begin to start around combating anti-Blackness, we found out that there is a limited amount of people from South LA with the ability to do facilitation around these conversations. So what we decided to do as organizations in South LA, as part of an initiative, we said, you know what, we have to look internally at organizations, how do we practice anti-Blackness within our organizations, but also how do we build the capacity of facilitators in our neighborhoods to be able to speak to this so that we can educate more people in our community around this. So we developed this combating anti-Black racism curriculum, very deep, with a lot of, understand the history, but also with the idea of developing common solutions, systemic solutions, understanding how policies roll out with this kind of bias that exists or this kind of hate that exists and how people practice that in policy development and in government or in organizations or in the private sector as well. And so we felt it was important to build a base, so we've trained about 25 people now, and we actually have a contract with the LA versus Hate from the county, which is invested in trying to figure out how to do more education. And the intention is to not only build the capacity of trained facilitators in this content, but also to go out and educate folks in the schools, in community centers, also in government. We're finding out that while the County Board of Supervisors has done a lot to address this issue of anti-blackness or anti-discrimination, you could pass policy, but it doesn't mean that departments are going to implement it in a way that has impact, unless those people who work in those departments are also committed to this process. And a lot of it is lack of understanding, lack of how do you operationalize this tremendous curriculum that we're talking about, that is about understanding where does this root mentality come from. Once we are able to do that and understand that with black folks in this case, the idea would be like, well, how are we looking at this from an indigenous perspective, or how we're looking at this from a Latino immigrant perspective. The idea is to really invest in building the infrastructure to train, educate, and really go to scale with this information so that we can not only address these issues in our community, but also in systems, in schools, in government. As we've seen, the biggest concern without that I think a lot of folks had around the comments that were made by those elected officials in relation to, they wasn't only just talking about black folks, it was talking about indigenous folks and other marginalized populations, but the key thing is like, if these are people who have the power to make decisions and policy that impacts everybody in the city, then even if they're not representing our community per se, it has an impact on black people and other folks across the city. That's what I think was so alarming, was that the ability to have influence on how decisions are made and how laws and policies are run. So I think that we have to think about the inside-outside approach to understanding how we begin to address this. Through education is critical. And then I think we begin to deconstruct how these institutions work with our community, engage our community, so that in this case, Latino immigrants feel comfortable to identify something as a hate crime, as opposed to some sort of ingrained policy that is discriminating against an entire Latino immigrant community, for example, in employment or in housing, for example.
No, I really appreciate you saying that, because I think one of the important things that has come up again and again in the conversation with education, but the accompanying theme is that there needs to be that cultivation of relationships, like authentic relationships that are coming from a place of either shared geographical space or, background. So I think you hit it right on the nose. And I kind of want to take a little bit of a shift here, because I think this relates to the work that we do in the newsroom and the coverage that we do, right? So I want to talk a little bit about like media gap and how the coverage of, quote unquote hate crimes and the large umbrella of hate crimes in Latino communities. When it comes to holding, I guess, media accountable, what are some of the ways that you see, journalists like myself or newsrooms or larger newsrooms, big media platforms, either bringing awareness to important issues or falling short of them?
I'll start with that one. Because I think one of the most important things and critiques that I'll say from it is that, and I can't speak to what high executives within press and media are asking for journalists to report on, because we know that at the end of the day, it could be driven by what gets more clicks, what gets more attention, and that pressure of it being an industry, I think sometimes causes the important stories, the things that are happening on the field, from being reported, and then which helps to make the noise so that we can take these things more serious and then affect the policy. And I think that the incident that happened that caused my special election is a very good example of that, right? It made national news. You had the President of the United States talking about it because it was so egregious. But, I also have moments where in my district I had a homeless woman, had a child, and had no medical attention, and the baby passed away. And nobody covered that, but yet there was a lot of attention that was placed on me that same week for something that could have just been taken care of with a direct call to my office, right? But it was sensational, and it just is what it is. But I think it's important to elevate things like the LA County report on what's going on in the county with the numbers of hate. So I think that that's the first step. It's almost like if we need journalists to be community organizers themselves and advocate for being able to write about these sort of things if it specifically is something that is a reflection of your own community. And I hear about it all the time, right? People jump around because they want to land in that location where they're going to be able to write and tell the stories that they want. And I think that that's part of it.
Well, I think the question is why LMC exists, right? I mean, we exist because we're trying to create new narratives and change the culture that is not driven by what, if it bleeds, it leads mentality, but more about what are the positive examples. What is happening in our community that's different? What is the struggle showing us? Being able to tell our own narratives is why local ethnic media needs to exist. Because if not, we're being driven by national corporate understanding. Like we have to change that culture, and I think it starts by us being able to tell our narratives, tell our stories of the positive things and the challenging things that are going on. Be maybe solution oriented in how we tell our stories. I talk about be more inclusive of the different identities that make up our neighborhoods. I mean, I think those are critical pieces. I think it starts with what LMC is about, which is generating a space where people like yourselves and others can talk about these stories, and we begin to change that culture and maybe change the industry altogether. That's what I think about when you ask a question like how do we begin to change that, is really investing more in localized ethnic media on multiple platforms, but hopefully where we can develop some data from those platforms to show, is it making an impact, is it making a difference? Because if not, then it's also just an experiment without the ability to really learn from it.
I would just add briefly, this is me putting on my social science hat, and a little bit of history here. So I was born in like the 1970s. In the 1970s, there were 9 million Latinos in the United States. You could fit all of the Latino population in LA County. LA County is about 10 million. That's how big or small we were. We went from 9 million to the current data is 65 million. It's 20% of the U.S. population. So the media has a responsibility to do two things, I would say. And I would categorize it or into two broad themes. Create bonding opportunities and bridging opportunities. I'll talk about bridging opportunities later when we talk about coalitions, bridging politically with non-Latino communities, other minoritized groups. But the bonding opportunities, how do we create bonding opportunities for 65 million people? Do we really know each other? And that's a hard question. I mean, what do I know about, once upon a time, Latinos were large. There wasn't a Latino population, or Latin or Hispanic, these pan-ethnic terms. There were Mexican Americans in the Southwest and a handful of states, Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, Cubans in Miami. That's completely changed. And so our understanding of the Latino population has to evolve with that new demographic reality. And I don't envy the media because your task is just exponentially harder from what it was when it was just 9 million people and it was largely Mexican Americans in Los Angeles, San Antonio, Phoenix, a few other places. I also don't envy my panelists, my colleagues here, elected officials who now have to navigate those complex realities or have to navigate social services or police departments. I mean, it's a much more complex world, much more complex, diverse community. And I don't have an answer for the media. I'm just pointing out these are the demographic realities for the media, and it's a challenge.
And I do want to name something really important here, is that there's a distinction between media as like a conglomerate, right, an entity, and what we're doing here, which is independent journalism in a lot of ways. We're a relatively small newsroom, and we're always trying to find ways to kind of hold ourselves accountable and create better avenues for coverage. But I think it's really important to name that because independent journalism is at risk right now, right? Like you're seeing these small local newsrooms getting shut down. You're seeing, publications like LA Taco and the LA Press all are at risk. You know, you saw LA Times, which is this huge entity, gutted entire departments and lost primarily journalists of color. So if you have the motivation and the drive to continue to amplify these types of stories and narratives, then you should be investing in independent media as well. So this is just my slight call to action, because obviously I'm passionate about this. But I wanted to ask a question to our CALÓ News reporter Brenda, who did such a beautiful job in her presentation of kind of highlighting something about hate crime coverage. But you know, we talk a little bit about how difficult it is for survivors and victims of hate crimes to come forward and even share their stories, because a lot of them in the community don't want to be labeled as victims. And this is open to the panel as well, but I wanted to direct it first to Brenda. How do you see our role as journalists in basically taking care of consideration and capturing these narratives?
I think personally, I feel like care comes a long way, and listening comes a long way. I think when I've had folks share either like them seeing a hate incident happen to them or to their neighbors or to their colleagues, it's a very emotional, like traumatic experience. So it takes time. You have to hold space for them and not be like, okay, as a reporter, but like, okay, let's move on. Like, there's no moving on from something like that. Like, really holding space and having folks just express themselves, because sometimes you're like the first person that they've told, or the first person besides their family that they've told. And I think meeting them where they're at comes a long way. I also know that, again, I think I'll bring in language again, because again, language barriers are so unfortunate, and sometimes talking about it, like someone will tell me like, oh, I could tell you, but I'll tell you in Spanish, like I'll tell you in something like in ways that I'm more comfortable. And I think not all journalists will be like, oh yeah, I'm open to hearing it, or like I can translate that, but I think having reporters that could do that is goes a long way as well. And yeah, someone said it, like being community organizers as well, caring for your community. I think you are a reporter, but at the same time, more than anything, you're human and you're part of the community that you are representing. So sometimes taking off the hat of a journalist and putting on just the hat of a friend or a hat of a listener, I think goes a long way.
That's perfect. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
You know, I do want to add on to that, because that reminds me of, you know, I can tell that I'm in a room full of very educated people. And very educated people are much better at, you know, unpackaging these sort of things and discussing these sort of things. And, you know, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley. I'm from Sun Valley. Very fortunate that the magnet program gave me the opportunity to go to an amazing university like UC Berkeley. And I say that with a lot of sense of responsibility to acknowledge the privilege with what that is. So I always knew that I was going to go to college and do political science. I fell in love with community work really young because I had parents and siblings that liked helping at the park and helping at the church. But I also minored in Chicano studies just because I could, right? Straight up, I just could, so I did. And I had a professor who once told us, it was a professor, a Chicano studies class about Chicanos in higher education and education in general, where I got exposed to things like the school to prison pipeline and the Latino higher education pipeline. And I will never forget that that professor told us, if you think you're cool because you made it to UC Berkeley, without the respect, you are nothing and no one until you can go back to your community and claim that you helped someone else get here. And with that, I always felt like, okay, so you get your degree, you're in a place of privilege, but what are you going to do to, you know, make the community a better place? And I always knew that I was going to go away for school, but come back and work in Los Angeles, this is where my family is, and whatnot. So I tried to make sure that in all the jobs that I've ever had, whether it was being an organizer with the environmental justice space, economic justice space, gender equity space that I remember that it's not just about moving the community in a certain direction to focus on creating better policies, but also that we're leading by example and making sure that we're always creating leaders to know that what they learned in the process of, doing community work with me, that they feel empowered to go back and pay it forward. So as educated folks, as folks of privilege, it is even more important for us to not allow these sort of conversations to just stay at the water cooler level, but into substantive spaces where we can really talk about change and pushing it back into making even our cousins, and our neighbors who didn't necessarily get to go to higher education and feel comfortable to do this, also be able to talk and improve themselves, because it's just not appropriate to, talk about race or be racist, because it happens to sometimes be glamorized in culture through me, through art or whatnot, like songs, rappers, and stuff like that.
I get to have a lot of platicas, and that's like I told you all that I got to do. That's a fun part of the job. So I get to do a lot of internal dialogue with community members. One of my favorite groups that I was doing was at a local high school in Gold Heights. And part of my work, one of my workshops is called Decolonizing Language, and this is in Spanish. So talking to folks about what language do we use now that's racist, or language that we use that's ableist, and teaching folks that. I don't think you need a degree to be able to do this work, and there's an assumption that like elders in our community or people in the Latino community, they go to college, they don't have a formal education, they don't understand things. They do. Like I sit there and I talk to my elders about it, and I had a group of like 16 doñas, right? All from Gold Heights, different parts of Gold Heights. They would see me like going to markets, we saw each other in the community, and I made the group very safe space, like, and talk to them about that idea, and explaining to them that people will make mistakes in this group, and some people would make a racist comment. And so how do I address that? And so it was a teaching moment on how I addressed an act of racism that would occur in the group, and how not to just immediately punish, right? In my activism journey growing up, I can tell you in undergrad, I was an internet warrior. I was ready to go. If someone messed up, I would go click and be like, you said this wrong, or you messed this up. But like through my process of growing up in this field and learning and wanting to foster more growth in the community, you change your ways, right? And so one example with this community group is we had a mom talk about how she would make a comment about her granddaughter's hair. Her granddaughter was Black Mexican and her other granddaughter was Filipina Mexican, different children. The way that she referenced her hair, and she was confused why the child's mother did not like her. And so it was addressing that idea, right? Talking about it, bringing in a guest speaker to talk to them about, specifically the Crown Act, right? We talked about the Crown Act together, and these are all monolingual Spanish speakers. Most of them were undocumented coming here, and never getting the opportunity to go through educational workshops or schooling and things like that, so they were willing to learn. And so it's interesting that maybe flash forward a couple months into these workshops, because I did them for a good 6 months, an incident of racism happened, and I watched one of them use the tools we talked about and how to talk about racism and corrected it in a good way, in the sense that it built community amongst themselves. And I think that's another thing that we definitely need to start doing more, is going back home. A lot of us do go to college far away, and then we move to nicer neighborhoods because we want to get out of the hood or the ghetto. But I sometimes feel like we need to go back and help our own communities and teach people things like that. For example, earlier with the media discussion, like I brought this up in the sense that when Univision covered Black Lives Matters, they called them bagos on TV. They called all the protesters bagos. And so hearing that terminology, my parents listening to that, their assumption was people protesting were bagos, and not that it was a civil rights violation, not that anything was happening. And it was teaching my parents that discussion and breaking down the language and why we need to use different terminology when addressing people, and shifting it almost, and talking about examples that are more dear to them. What happened when Cesar Chavez was running the world, right? Remember how he called immigration on people? Like it's it was whoever framed the narrative. So let's not let them control the narrative. Let's control the narrative from the community point of view. So I definitely think that that goes to say with connecting all of these together.
And I think that's such an important point, because so many folks, even outside of the Latino community, we're conditioned, right? We've grown up hearing these languages and these words and these things, and they kind of sit in like an internalized, almost compartmentalized part of our brain. And so by default, we don't see anything immediately wrong with them. So I think that's such an amazing tool to share and use reference, right? And so when we talk about coalition building, and I know you had something specifically you'd like to bring up around this, but what are some of the ways in which data has indicated that Latinos are empowered to act?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So I talked about the importance of bridging, and that is to form coalitions with African Americans, with the AAPI community, with other minoritized groups. Latinos, one of the things, the truisms of Latino politics is that you can't do it alone. That's probably true about any politics. You have to form coalitions to have political empowerment. And what the data shows us is that Latinos want to form coalitions. They see value in forming coalitions with African Americans. So contrary to these stereotypes that Latinos have this anti-Black sentiment, when we look at questions about affinity, high levels of affinity toward the African American community, toward Black folks, high levels of affinity toward Asian Americans, even much higher than affinity toward the non-Hispanic white population. So the groundwork is there for Latinos to build those bridges. There's a desire to want to form these coalitions. The affinity is there. There's this sense among Latinos that we're in the same boat. We need to collectively work together to address these things. Yet, there is also missed opportunities for that kind of engagement, and that's where the panelists, the work that they're doing on the ground in terms of these dialogues, in terms of working with folks on the ground, education opportunities, the media, that's where you have these important opportunities to start creating those bridges. So Latinos say they want these bridges, but they also say we don't know how to do these bridges. We need help. We need assistance. So that's where experts, but also not only experts, but people that are influentials can help create those opportunities for bridge building.
Yeah, we have a certain level of responsibility as quote leaders of organizations or teachers or institutions. We have a responsibility to take that leadership and say it's important that we build coalitions. It's important to move an agenda. You know, an anti-white supremacist agenda requires coalition building, requires people of color coming together, requires us bringing everyone in that's in the margins to get involved in these kind of dialogues to really have a systemic transition. Or else all we do is have rotations of people, sometimes even people of color in power that oppress our community just as bad as white folks do. Because, you know, last I've seen, we haven't had white representation in South LA and East LA in a very long time. Yet the economic conditions, school conditions, you know, they're still somewhere in a very similar way that people would frown upon and say that things haven't changed all that much. So there's that. But I think if we have to take the leadership and say, hey, we need to, when we talk about geography, we talk about policy, for example, I find it interesting as a Chicano working in South Los Angeles for 30 years. I'm in a weird space because I'm not Chicano enough for the East Siders or Northeast LA or sometimes even Valley folks, even though I do go to Poly, right? It's a Valley, right? But yet, all the critical progressive policy change that's happened in the city of LA comes out of South LA. That's benefited the Valley, that's benefited the East Side. We're talking about school reform, land use, renters' rights, economic and workforce development. A lot of that comes from organizations working together, black and brown, in South LA, and sometimes building coalitions that include API community or Native American folks that then do extend beyond like South LA. We have to begin to appreciate collectively what we can do and take leadership in doing that. And it's also important to understand too, that not everyone's at the same place. And understand that when I talk about solidarity politics with Latinos on the east side of South LA, the 9th Council District is majority Latinos. Yet they vote for black council members every election. So Latinos can vote for black folks and find comfort in that, right? And at the same time, there's still more maturity, more development that needs to happen with that population to be able to feel comfortable with a very empowered black community to sit down and say, like, how do we talk about these issues where you've had more experience and leadership development than we've had? So there's opportunities for coalition building, and then there's still the need to do a deep dive investment in building Latino leadership of populations that have not had the chance to be involved actively, like Latina immigrant women in South Central Los Angeles, who, like I said earlier, are many times involved in pushing policy by giving testimony, by being volunteers, by being activists, but are still not in any positions of leadership. I mean, board of directors, they're not running nonprofits, they're not in executive positions. So we still need to look at that as internally ourselves and figure out how do we invest in building that leadership, but that is conscious and aware of the need to build solidarity politics with other populations across the city so that we begin to do more education to address the fact that we are colonized people, Latino, indigenous people, and so that racist stuff was taught to us. And just the way it was taught to us, we could be educated in our way to get rid of that mentality. If we begin to talk about how it plays out in our communities, we're products of the caste system that was taught to us. And that is why we see people the way we do. And then we're disempowered in many ways, politically and economically. So it's like, well, we're in the same room and we're feeling the same tension, but I need to come across and challenge you as opposed to what is the systemic conditions that's creating this environment by which we have this tension collectively. And so there's a lot of learning that's happened. 92 was a flashpoint. Everybody thought the media portrayed South Central when it was on fire. Oh, it's all these black folks. No, it was Latinos too. As a matter of fact, I think the statistics, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think there were more Latinos arrested than black folks for being involved in quote unquote the looting in South LA, but yet the media portrayed it, oh, it's black folks doing this. They're burning the community. It was black and brown people there saying, hey man, this is wrong. Like there's a systemic inequality here, and we're lashing out because we don't know what else to do. And so these are things that we need to continue to struggle through and educate ourselves and have those critical dialogues and the difficult conversations that people don't like to have.
So I agree with everyone in terms of we need help, right? We need to continue to have the dialogues. And with myself, you know, in the role of the capacity that I'm at now, and being somebody, you know, that ran in a special election, given the scandal, as I call it, my role is to provide that help and to create the spaces of the dialogue. So, you know, in my personal story, one of the things that I've always done to pay it forward within the Latino community was that right after college, you know, I come from a family, it was always my story that my family represents the best case scenario of what LAUSD can do and the worst case scenario of what LAUSD can do. Because me and my two sisters went to amazing universities and had great lives post that experience. But I also in my family have a brother that is incarcerated, and oftentimes people say, was it a different mother? Is it a different father? Did you go to a different school? No, it was the same thing. But when I go to the university and I realize the different experience where when a young girl, Latina, or just a girl, a woman in general, in the Latino community, you know, we're loud and ambitious, the educators tend to say, she's a leader, and then they empower us. Whereas with that's what happened with me and my sisters, but with my brother, it was like, he's obnoxious, go to the dean. Or you're being loud, get out of here, right? So coming back, for 10 solid years, I've been putting together a youth leadership conference called Adelante Hombre Latino Summit. Close to 10 high schools come, 300 to 500 young boys and men of color come and are exposed to workforce development and, you know, stories of Latino leaders. Well, not leaders, they're just professions, right? Like you can be an attorney, you can be an engineer, you can do all of these amazing things. There's people that come out of your community and do this. And one of the most beautiful things that I always saw there is that at the high school level, at the youth level, there was individuals who didn't care that it was a flyer, we're gonna come learn or come speak or hear from somebody that was Latino. Because I always have had a very solid population of Filipino Americans and also African Americans from the area of the schools. Because it was a Saturday and they wanted to be with their friends, all right? So now though, that I'm in this position, I have been very intentional to show unity with the Black African American community. So recently, for example, with my colleague Marquis Harris-Dawson, we helped make the Black Planners of Los Angeles become an official association. So that was a form of partnership. But what I'm and then another thing that I about is having a Black African American on my staff, both in my formal team, but also on my campaign team, and just making sure that they're also part of the space of all the work that I do. And in addition to that, what I'm most excited about is the next step, right? I think that one of the first steps to healing post the scandal that got me here was that my predecessor did resign, right? That's the first step of accountability. But now there's got to be more. And I think within my district, we still feel like something more has to give. So what I'm going to be doing within the summer and really figuring out is that a lot of people don't know that the founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, is actually from my district. She grew up with that nice. And I've known her for a very long time. We've been friends for quite a while. And we've always talked about, we have to do something to remind folks that the Valley once had a very large Black African American community, but got pushed out for multiple reasons, for multiple policies, from banking to housing discrimination that pushed them more out into affordability into the Antelope Valley. So we're going to be coming together and making a plan of how to re-stimulate and bring out the Black community of the San Fernando Valley in a way where we're talking about coalition building with your Latino neighbors. So one step forward is coming, so to speak, from our team. Intentionality.
A couple of things of coalition building. So one thing that I really tell people to be adamant about is don't participate in performative coalition building. It's really big that happens. Because I always tell people the revolution is not going to come with a 501(c)(3) status. And we see all these nonprofits hosting these Juneteenth events, but then you look at their board, we're all the Black folk on the board, we're all the Latinos on the boards, it's all white folk. And so definitely watch out for that. 2, definitely do your own research. Do your own research, be impartial about it. Also don't just vote because of representation, just because it's about a Black person that looks like you. Look at other communities and see who actually is representing the needs of the people. 3, definitely look for people-powered movements. Because oftentimes, like I said, performative politics and performative coalition building does happen. And 4, as along the lines of coalition building for hate crimes and hate incidents, I definitely think that we need to turn internally and look at ourselves and work on ourselves, because I can tell you that I still have a lot that I'm working through on conscious bias. And I meet people all the time in the LA social justice scene that are like, oh, I'm not racist, or I'm not this, or I'm not homophobic. We gotta work on it. It's a constant process. The idea of being woke is an idea, it's not an actual status. You don't just become woke one day, it's something you continually work on. So definitely, I think with coalition building of hate crimes and hate incidents, donate your time, get involved. If someone has been a victim of a hate crime or hate incident, reach out to see what you can do to help them out. The more of us that are there, the better. Alone, we're like little ants. You can step on us, but if you see a swarm of ants coming at you, you're not gonna be able to take all of us out. So.
Well, thank you guys so much. I did want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions that they might have. We have one question back there by our editor, Denise.
Hi, I'm Torres, editor of CALÓ News, and my question is, what is a community-oriented way to talk to someone about a racist comment they have?
I'm going to answer that from a personal perspective because it's not easy. I had an aunt. My aunt is very tall, very fair, black hair, Snow White, as I call her, Clara. But she has a granddaughter who is a little bit darker, and I've always had a history of not always getting along with this aunt, but we're working through it. We're great now. But her granddaughter, the last time I saw her, she was referring to her as her, I don't like even saying the word, as her Prieta chula, a chula, right? And I actually told her, tia, you're a very white, cacique Mexican woman. You really shouldn't do that to your granddaughter. And she's like, what do you mean? This is what, I've been calling her this for years. I'm like, yeah, take it from your niece that you're always talking about, oh, you're so smart, you're so educated, from a social science society, you kind of have to stop, because you don't even know if it really hurts her internally. And it's easy for you back to, we just have to be brave and recognize our own power to be brave. And this is me taking it on in my own backyard, right, at my own mother's kitchen table. So you just gotta do it. It's not gonna be easy, but you have to.
I see a couple more questions. You want to start? Yes.
Thank you for coming. It's very important in Hispanic people in the South Central. I live in South Central. And it's difficult that ethnicities, the African American, get the leadership. And when the Hispanic people going to the apply for leadership in some people's government, then push the Latin don't go. And we are going to restructure where we going to the leadership Latin in South Central. We going to work in better leadership because it's very important. I stay for the member for Community Coalition with Karen Bass, the mayor, and I have the representative Hispanic people in South Central for Community Coalition. But it's very hard talking to the group, no specific the members, but the staff. The staff is lacking speed. It's different, it's controversial. When the membership lacking work for a platform, oh, we are going to close to the liquor store. When we're going to the more Hispanic people invited, the Hispanic going to, okay, we're going to, because this is schools. And then looking the more people Hispanic representative, the staff said, oh, it's more Hispanic, it's not good. And then put the African American in from the Hispanic, it's not very good. And we are going to restructure, we work together. Now I open in the Democratic Club, Chicano Latino, I'm president now, and we are going to restructure and then I want to my dream is the South Central is same for Hispanic people because we are pay taxes, we have more people who work, we have more students, and what happened? What happened? We stay silent. We need restructure, we need work, and we're going to the vote, and we are good for the election, what happened in the South Central. We are changed because we are now the big group for Latin in South Central. This is my point.
Well, I don't know if it was a question or a statement, what you feel is needed in South LA. And first of all, South LA is a huge area, over 800,000 people, 3 districts within the city alone, not including the county. And different parts of South LA's Latino population is at a different level of empowerment than others, I can tell you that. You know, in the 9th Council District, where I've been doing work now for almost 30 years, all the way down to Watts, we've had to do a lot to build the capacity of Latinos to understand their power, understand the history of South Los Angeles, understand their own journey. But I think for us it's important, like I said earlier, that there's moments where you need to be working in the coalition side and building multiracial leadership, but there's also a need to also recognize where folks are at in that process. I also don't want to say that all black folks in South LA think a certain way, because I think that's not fair either. Say there's different types of political movements within South LA, within the black community as well. And I think it's important that you recognize where you fit with people that have similar interests as you do. As you mentioned, with Community Coalition, that's one organization. It's one of the strongest organizations in South LA because of its history, where it came from, what it's done, how it's influenced policy and change. But there's also other organizations that might be also focusing on trying to figure out the multiracial organizing element that may be better suited for someone like yourself. There's Scope, there's Sage, there's Cadre, there's tons of organizations, right? And I think the good thing is that you're building your own group. I think it's important that there's enough space, in my opinion, in South LA to build a lot of leadership. And I think that the more leadership we build, the more opportunities there'll be for us to come together and talk about common agendas and common issues and figure out the equity angle. Because I think the concern that a lot of people have, especially black folks, is the numbers representation issue doesn't speak to black issues. It's about equity with black folks. That means you gotta look at statistically where black folks fall in terms of economics, in terms of certain conditions in LA, in relation to the proportionality of their size. So their concern is, what happens is our population gets smaller in terms of what happens to black communities. Whereas Latino folks, well, the argument I hear is, well, we're 51% of the population, what does that mean for Latinos? Well, it doesn't mean that we get 51% of things either. That also hasn't helped us historically. It's really understanding what the issues are and trying to work together, in my opinion, with people like Imelda and other folks who have the relationships at City Council to move policy. You need 8 votes at City Council to move everything. You need to have coalition building at City Council. You need to have coalition building at the county to move anything. And that's going to require building those relationships and building the leadership capacity to do so.
I think that's the perfect way to end things. I just want to thank the panelists so much. Before we wrap up the event, I think we want to say some closing remarks. If you want to introduce yourself.
My name is Arturo Carmona. I'm the president of the Latino Media Collaborative. Just wanted to thank you for being here. This is a very important conversation for us to have. As we heard from several of our panelists, we need to have these tough conversations. And we not only need to have them with this very educated group of folks, but also within our, with all of our constituents, with all of our folks, Spanish-speaking, non-Spanish speakers, English-dominant Latinos. We all need to be talking about this because what we didn't hear about, we didn't have the time to go into it, the research that Adrian and the team out of UCLA found was that in the focus groups with Spanish-speaking Latinos and in the focus groups with English-dominant Latinos, our folks need help, need more tools, need more ways to have those tough conversations around race, both within the community and how we deal with anti-indigeneity, anti-racism conversations. Our folks need help. It's not just about nuestra tía or nuestros papás or familiares, but it's also, younger Latinos that kind of carry some of these issues that Benny and the team here talked about. So we're here to help elevate this conversation as part of the CALÓ team, which is one of our flagship initiatives of the Latino Media Collaborative, but also to figure out ways how we influence other newsrooms, how we influence the conversation at a broader level, how we can also have this conversation with public policy officials and other sectors. So we're excited to be advancing and elevating this type of research. I also want to echo Michelle and thank the panelists, thank all of you. There's going to be coverage coming out of this conversation. We look forward to continuing to have and building these tools and partnering with folks to figure out how we can help more and more people have these conversations. So thank you so much.